And that is actually from the election of 1912. So we'll get to, I just think that cartoon's kind of funny. Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft, Teddy Roosevelt, 4 viable candidates for president in 1912. A rarity. So, remember, McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt was elected president. What was Roosevelt's foreign policy of economic imperialism in Latin America? What was that called again? You remember? Big stick. Yeah, big stick. Gunboat diplomacy. Good. All right. And even though he was a progressive, his first term was, or at least the last part of McKinley's second term that he took over, was not radically different. Even though he did a long Marcus Hanna. There would be 3 big things for that first part of Roosevelt's term. First off, there was a coal strike in West Virginia called the Anthracite Coal Strike. And Roosevelt, for the first time in American history, did fair arbitration to come up with a deal between the 2 sides. Always before this, the employers had the power of the federal government behind. Remember Rutherford B. Hayes sending troops in 1877, Cleveland sending troops in 1894 at the Pullman strike. And here is Roosevelt, and that's actually supposed to be the employer. You must give in a little bit to the workers. Unheard of. Workers were always at the low end of the totem pole. Also, a Department of Labor was created, even though this wasn't Roosevelt's initiative. He signed the law, and the first Labor Day, a day off for workers, but not on May 1st, which was the 8-hour workday, which was the Haymarket affair. Don't want to give union that victory. And Roosevelt was the first president to really use the power of the presidency to influence votes, to influence the people. If the president says anything, it is news. Did you ask for a book? Did I get one? You got one? Good. If the president says anything, and realizing that it'll be reported, people will pay attention, that was big news. Whatever the president said. And every president in some way would begin to use this. And as media became bigger, information get out faster, they would use it more. President Trump understands this completely, that anything he says will be news. And he is very much always in the news. He knows that, he wants that, he craves being in the news, and so he uses that ability. By the way, speaking of this being in the news, it's mandated by the Constitution that a president must give a State of the Union address. And for the first 150 years, it was literally just give him a speech, or to give him basically a document. State of the Union. Now it's a speech, broadcast on all the major networks. President Trump's State of the Union address will be tonight. That's 7 o'clock. And this is kind of a big deal because President Trump's approval rating is maybe the lowest ever for a president right now. And no president has ever been this low in his first term ever in American history. Not polls, great salt and change. And so the big deal. So where are we at? Oh, so here he is, like using his influence to take over the Senate. Didn't quite happen that way. But in 1904, Roosevelt's going to run on his own merit in the election. Teddy Roosevelt always went by TR, loved TR. That's why, for example, his cousin who admired him greatly, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, would go by FDR. And John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK. Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. So Hanna had died. Hanna decided, I want to be senator, and got elected senator in 1902 by the Ohio Assembly, and then promptly had a heart attack. So that left an opening for Roosevelt even more. Alton Parker would be chosen because Bryan lost 2 times in a row. The Democrats didn't want to go with Bryan again. And he was economically very conservative. Remember, that's laissez-faire, anti-union, opposed to any antitrust. He was very conservative. And so Democrats basically did a 180. Roosevelt was much more liberally economically liberal, sorry. Well, Roosevelt would do another first, like the bully pulp. Knowing the importance of a slogan, remember Tippecanoe and Tyler too? He directly tied it to a specific set of proposals, his platform, what he promised and pledged to do for the American public, his progressive platform, and gave it a name, the Square Deal. And it's a clever name. I pledge to you a square deal. No matter who you are, remember the coal strike? I pledge to you a square deal. And so even though most voters might not know the details of the square deal, they remember the name Spurgeon. Square deal. Yeah, he's here for us, a square deal. And after this, virtually every politician will try to give their campaign and name their proposals. Some will be relatively minor changes or not that big of a deal. Some will be huge. Most famously, his cousin, partially by accident, but it worked out really well for him, would call his program the New Deal. That's Franklin Roosevelt. So we got Square Deal, New Deal. Harry Truman would have the Fair Deal. Dwight Eisenhower would have dynamic conservatism. John Kennedy would have the New Frontier. Lyndon Johnson would have the Great Society. Richard Nixon, New Federalism, and on and on and on. And so people might not know what it stands for, but they remember the name. And that's going to be a big deal. Roosevelt and the New Deal will be intertwined. Just like, once again, keeping it with current times. President Trump took Ronald Reagan's slogan, let's make America great, directly verbatim, just took it. But then that became a slogan. And now people say they're for that. They even gave it an acronym. And it's not really what it stands for, the actual programs. It's just that name represents my belief. So, clever politics. And it's government action. The government is going to do things. So, it's also very much that populist program from the Ohio Convention back in 1892. The populists. For me, awesome. The populist program. So remember, Ohio Convention, 1892. So let's go through some of these things. So first off, this progressive income tax. Higher tax rates for the very wealthy, which not only has the effect of raising wages for the majority of people underneath. I'll tell you how that works when we get to the New Deal. But also, that's where the money is. Capitalism, the great incentive for the capitalism is that they get the profit, but that flows the money to the top. That's why they should pay more taxes according to the progressive. But also an estate tax for very large estates. Social Security, old age pension. Another big deal for the populace. But most people, when they retired, which was a brand new thing with the Industrial Revolution, they were impoverished. Absolutely destitute, impoverished. And so a little bit of a pension that pulled them out of that, pulled them out of poverty, which would not happen to the New Deal, that's the italics, but would get it, the proposal out there. Regulation, antitrust, consumer protection, there are other things too, worker protection. We talked about regulation, I need to talk about that again. 8-hour workday, which does what to wages? Yeah, 8-hour workday raises wages. There were other things that labor wanted, but he was not necessarily pro-union. Child labor laws was another big one, which also raises wages. He also, part of the Square Deal would be women's rights, especially suffrage, and a brand new area, conservation. And I'll explain reclamation in just a second. Now, conservation is not the same of a more modern term as in the last 50 years, environmentalism. They're cousins, but it's not the same thing. Conserve for later use, or reclaim land that, for example, is arid and dry for farming. So it's not the same as preserving the environment. It's not the same as a healthy ecosystem. It's more complex. I better save the forest now because I want to use it tomorrow. So here it is. Now, the square dance, the square deal dance, Roosevelt, and instead of the president dancing to the power of the monopolies, they're dancing to Roosevelt's call. Not the way it happened. It was quite successful. And no one knew who the heck Alton Parker even was. So a landslide sweep, sorry about that, landslide sweep, red is Republican here. Once again, only the solid South, because there's no Republican Party in the South. In fact, Missouri, which didn't really have a Republican Party, voted for Roosevelt. Again, see, weird to say it that way. And he actually took a lot of money from business groups, monopolists. Rockefeller and others gave him money. J.P. Morgan gave him money, with the assumption was that whole square deal was just talk. He didn't really mean it. He'll do what we want. Maybe they'll pass another meaningless bill like the Sherman Antitrust Act or the Interstate Commerce Act, and nothing will come out of this. Well, no. Roosevelt was very clear. I'll take your money, but I'm going to do the square deal. I'm going to try to do it. But virtually none of it will pass. Virtually none. Everyone got that? Virtually none of it will pass. Partially because Roosevelt said, I will not run for another term. Meaning, he was already a lame duck. But also, the old guard of the Republicans, the Marcus Hamill wing, the majority of Republicans who are conservative economically are going to get their revenge and make sure that Roosevelt's square deal would go nowhere. Child labor laws went nowhere, for example. Nowhere in Congress. They would get his revenge, they get their revenge. And then really get it 4 years later. So, TR's second term, one big accomplishment would be the Heifer Act. It strengthened the ICC and did something about railroad monopolies. I think this cartoon's pretty funny. So here it's showing Roosevelt in front of now strengthened ICC, and it's been rolling a little bit high, meaning railroads charging too much, and I love how they show the railroads in a fur coat. And by the way, check pants, kind of stop. I'm with you. They should come back. Who agrees, right? Yeah, it's coming back. And there would be limited success, just to review. Remember the jungle? We've already had this before. If you just write down, like, don't forget the jungle, that was during Roosevelt's second term, well, his first full term as president. Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act, just so you don't forget. That happened during Roosevelt. Here's the meat scandal that came from the jungle and other things. Other than that, nothing. Roosevelt would have no other major legislative successes in the field of antitrust or those progressive reforms except conservation. Roosevelt was greatly influenced by what they called then a naturalist. We'd say today environmentalist. So beyond a conservationist, named John Murray, who was desperate to save American treasures as forests, seeing them as an essential part of the survival of natural America, or as we would say today, the ecosystem. He'd be most famous for saving Yosemite Park and making that a national park. Yosemite, beautiful park. They almost damned this. They almost damned parts of Yellowstone. Wow. John Murray had great influence on him and another guy named Gifford Pinchot. But, for example, in its administration, they would create the Forest Service. But the Forest Service, the Department of the Interior is responsible for public land, was responsible for all public land. But Forest Service land would be different. It's under the Agricultural Department. And that should tell you what conservation is. If you ever see a Forest Service sign, it will say the Department of Agriculture. It's very interesting. You go see BLM land, Bureau of Land Management, and you'll say Department of Interior. And so we have a very kind of a bureaucratic mess if you know anything about public lands. But why Department of Agriculture? We're going to set aside Forest Service land now to preserve it, to cut down the trees. That's why it's part of the Department of Agriculture. To preserve the forest for later use. Or as Roosevelt saw it, it was more than just forests. There was a wave of extinctions. And Roosevelt was very worried that there will be another wave of extinction of animals that he wanted to shoot. He wanted to kill them himself. And so if they all die today, he can't kill them tomorrow. And I'm not exaggerating. That was his idea of conservation. Use it tomorrow. He desperately wanted to shoot. Have something to shoot tomorrow. And so save it for today. So another incredibly important act was the Reclamation Act. The Reclamation Act, we tried to reclaim land that was not usable for people. So not just conserve it, reclaim it. And the big thing was the arid American Southwest. Let me rephrase that. The arid American West. So as you can see from this map, this area right here. Remember I told you about the rain line when I talked about the West? It just didn't rain much here. No rain, no agriculture. So we want to reclaim it. How do you reclaim it? By getting water. So this would be a massive irrigation program. It still operates today. The Reclamations Act, the Bureau of Reclamations is an irrigation program to irrigate land that was too dry to use normally. So this would turn out to be the biggest dam building program in American history. It's a damn big program. Now, most of the dams will be built as part of his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal after the 1960s. But they began to dam all over the American Southwest, but then soon every place in the continental United States. And fitting in with the brand new electric dynamo, this would be combined with hydroelectricity. And so this dual-edged sword. And so by the 1960s, the Bureau of Reclamation is going to dam everywhere. Virtually every place in the continental United States that's good for a dam already has a dam. You can't build a dam just anywhere. The dam has got to be on something with a solid foundation, granite. If it's not granite, the water can undermine it. So for example, they can't build on limestone. Limestone undermines it, the dam goes. That happened a couple times. Tragically, the Teton Dam in Idaho went in 1974 and killed 300 people. So dams have to be built on granite or something solid. So if you look at a map of the continental United States, there are dams everywhere. Look at the Missouri, how many dams go on the Missouri? There's very few rivers in the United States that don't have dams. Montana has one of the longest free-flowing rivers in the United States left, the Yellowstone. They just about dammed it in Yellowstone National Park, right outside Yellowstone National Park, and right near Livingston. But for various reasons, they didn't count. Other than that, there's very few. Very few. No, they did not think of the environmental consequences of the dams, but this is the beginning of dams. One more thing it passed was called the Antiquities Act. Another proposal Roosevelt passed that would pass with only progressives, and it would set up areas to be preserved as antiquities known as monuments. So the president could set aside land and basically make it not quite a national park, but of limited use. With the idea being that the president can preserve these areas as important artifacts of American history, thus antiquities. And so virtually every president near the end of their term will set aside big areas of monuments, except for a few don't. Presidents that aren't into conservation or environmentalism like President Trump did. But these are some of the most famous ones. There's a bunch in Montana. The first one is going to be Devil's Tower in Montana, set aside as a national monument. They're run by the Department of the Interior, and right now it's actually working its way to the courts because the Trump administration wants to break apart these monuments and open it up, mostly for oil, for drilling. That's happening right now. So basically, they are challenging that case. I don't know where that's going to go. They're challenging the legacy of Teddy Wilson. So he was also known as the trust buster. Now, he didn't break up that many trusts, but he was the first president to use the Sherman Antitrust Act, SATA, against trust. The first one in American history. The Northern Securities Trust, a railroad trust, will be the first one broken up. That was on your quiz the other day. And that was basically the Great Northern went here, the Northern Pacific, and the railroad that kind of long here called the Bridgeton. That was the Northern Securities Trust. It did not, the Roosevelt administration did not allow that to go. I showed that in 1974, it happened anyways. But his Justice Department would also initiate a massive antitrust case on Standard Oil. Now, Standard Oil's monopoly was actually kind of breaking up in the market because of new oil discovered in Texas and Oklahoma. But 1910, under Taft, Standard Oil would be broken up. Now, it's not that they broke up a lot of monopolies. It was the fact that they used the Justice Department to stop monopolies, discouraged other efforts at making a monopoly. It stopped mergers down the road. That's why antitrust is a big deal. In your lifetime, Biden was pretty antitrust. First American president since, you have to go back to the 70s. And so a lot of mergers were stopped. They've all come back now because they know Trump has no problem with monopolies. And so that's why, like Netflix is going to buy Warner Brothers, probably. Or Paramount's going to buy them, which is going to be a big monopoly. In theater, probably get rid of theaters. Probably dead if that happens. And that's monopolies today. So you can discourage him or not discourage him. Here's him, the big stick, monopoly, but also this kind of mocking him or anything else in the West. Meeting in the little pell mell. That's not quite true. That wasn't Roosevelt. So just so you know, Standard Oil was broken up into 7 companies. That's how they broke it up. So they had to sell off assets from the main Standard Oil. But eventually now it is 3, and so this is being rolled into Exxon. So it's going to be now back to monopolies. And this is the popular view that Roosevelt wanted. That before, when Roosevelt first became president, all the big oil trusts looked down at him and tried to control him. But they couldn't control him, and now they're coming to him. That's not what happened at all. I should add one more story, though. Roosevelt, remember I told you how Roosevelt, I mentioned how he was kind of sickly as a child. And so when he got a little bit older, he really wanted to show that he was physical, fit, and manly. Manly, obviously very insecure about that. Look how tough I am. But one way he would do it is box. Here he is, boxing. This is bare knuckle, but he would box before a match. He would box, he would challenge people to box. Actually pretty good. Old style pugilism. Like this. A lot of uppercuts, a lot of haymakers, but he would box. And so when he was president, he continued to box. He's still a young man, early 40s. I know that doesn't seem young to you, but it's very young to me. And he would box in the basement of the White House. And he would challenge any relatively healthy looking man to come in and fight him. And then he'd beat the tar out because nobody wanted to punch the president. And so he would just go up. I mean, I guess he would take haymakers like this, just swing around and make bloody messes and spread up. They didn't want to punch the president. Well, on the staff of the French ambassador was a welterweight champion of Europe. So he was a lot smaller. but very good boxer, very quick, and about 15 years younger. And Roosevelt kept challenging him to fight in the basement. He didn't want to, want to fight. I mean, this could be an international incident. And finally he agreed. He kind of danced around Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was just, he kind of let Roosevelt hit him a few times. He was taking his haymakers and wildly swinging and annoying. So finally, when Roosevelt turned like this to punch, which is not something you do, bang, one hard jab right, and blinded him with his left arm. He catched Roosevelt's retina. Thus, it's even made the newspaper. I think this one's kind of funny. They did a drawing of it, but Roosevelt got a detached retina. No, that's nothing to do with it. You're wrong there. But that's how the president was blinded just about dying, boxing in the basement of finance. And don't forget, Roosevelt was young. He would do things like his kids would be running through. He had young kids, and they'd be playing, and he would just jump in the middle of cabinet meetings and start playing them. There were these new little toys called cat pistols. And he would pull them off, start shooting at people. Would that be the president? One more thing I'll tell you about Roosevelt. Washington, D.C. at that time was very rural. It was not an urban town. It didn't feel urban. In fact, there was still cattle and sheep grazing in front of the White House. And you know where the Washington Monument is? It's in the mall. The mall didn't exist. There was kind of a little hill the monument was on, and then it was kind of swampy land. And a couple of pools sitting there. Wasn't at all the way it looks today. That would all be done in the New Deal. And so Roosevelt would go swim in the little lakes. And of course, being a man and being manly, he would skinny dip. He'd go naked. But the big thing he would do is he would make other people go swimming with him, other men, and they all had to strip down and swim naked. In broad daylight, the president out in the middle with the Capitol right there. Okay, he was pretty insane. I can make you do this. That's what it is. So that was Roosevelt. I got a couple more Roosevelt stories to tell you, but this reminds me of this. I found this. I thought this was a good thing to bring up. Here's a poll taken in 2021, grain of salt, but still, it's what kind of animals you could beat up, asking Brits and Americans. And I gotta be clear about this. This has to be a bunch of guys. And so, like, that's British guys and Americans who think they could beat up a rat. And so, look how many Americans think they could beat up a grizzly bear. Yes, this is obviously a bunch of guys. Yeah, I can do it. Elephant, lion, king cobra. I just thought that was really funny. So nearly 20% think they could beat up a chimpanzee. No, they'll rip your face off, literally. So who thinks they could beat an elephant? They're not quite. The next assembly. Right? Well, not only did they get the revenge on Roosevelt, there was a near economic disaster. It turned out to be not as bad as 1893, called the Panic of 1907. There was a bubble in gold, bubble in railroads, also the ever-present bubble in real estate. There was a bank panic, near failures. JP Morgan actually gave some of its own banks money to save banks. We're not going to go into detail of the panic, but it showed the need of a national bank. Now, Roosevelt said he didn't want to run again. He wanted to run again. He loved being president. But this panic, he's going to be blamed for it, even though it would not be as bad as other panics. So he couldn't run again. So he had to act like he really didn't want to be president again. Thomas Jefferson did that. Grant kind of did that back in 1876. A lot of people. President, you got all that power and everyone kissing up to you. Clearly, guys like Teddy Roosevelt need people to, stop them. And so, now I'm saying that I like Teddy Roosevelt, but yeah, he's pretty insecure. And that means in 1808 or 1908, in 1908, Roosevelt kind of coerced William Howard Taft to run for president. Taft really thought Roosevelt was going to pick him to be on the Supreme Court. And it infuriated Taft, but he didn't. Remember, he did so well as governor of the Philippines. The Democrats tried for the last time with William Jennings Bryan. But Bryan had kind of wore out his welcome. He was not popular at all in urban areas. Taft was riding the wave of popularity of Roosevelt, but he wasn't Roosevelt, so conservative Republicans felt more comfortable with him. And the panic did not turn out to be as bad as it could have been. So the election was closer than 1904, but Solid South, a few other states, Taft won. Montana was razor thin, but it was for Taft. But Taft was much more conservative than Roosevelt economically. The square deal was not, Taft did not believe this. Taft was much more social Darwinistic. But the big issue was conservation. I should add, Roosevelt went to Africa right after he was president and went on the safari. There was a real worry that big game hunters, and even though it turned out to be also other reasons, but he was worried about big game hunters killing all the lions, the tigers, the gorillas, the elephants in Asia and Africa. And he wanted to kill them. So he went to Africa for nearly a year and killed it. He was responsible. And brought home all sorts of trophies. But he also he wrote 3 volumes about the safari in Africa. He was a prodigious writer. He wrote about 3,000 pages. He could just handwrite Canadian. Was really good writing. I've read a couple of this. It's not a whole book, but I read some. I read it in the British version. The story was, look how great I am. I expected that. But don't forget, prodigious writing. Come back to that in a second. Then he went to Europe and was treated, went to the various castles, treated by the crowns of Europe as kind of a celebrity. While that's going on, he started hearing disturbing reports from Washington about his most valued program, his only major success behind, besides Hepburn and her Food and Drug Act, conservation. And it was the Pinchot-Ballinger affair. Richard Ballinger was a conservative Republican chosen to be Secretary of the Interior. And he began to transfer land that was supposed to go to the Forest Service to private interests for oil, mainly oil and timber. And yeah, he got kickbacks. He got money under the table. A holdover from Roosevelt's administration, head of the Forest Service, Guilford Pinchot, exposed it. Pinchot was furious, didn't like Ballinger at all. They hated each other, as I understand it, not just because they had policy disagreements, they just didn't like each other. And so, this got back to Roosevelt in Europe, who immediately attacked Taft. How dare you go against my legacy? And Taft, furious at Roosevelt, Taft, do you want to be president? Back Ballinger and said he did nothing wrong, and therefore implying that's my policy. Even though Taft probably didn't even know what was going on. And that Roosevelt was furious. You've destroyed my legacy. So here's trying to show that Taft and Roosevelt are kind of bickering, and what's between them? Conservation. This would become a massive scandal. And when Roosevelt arrived back in the United States and was met at New York Harbor, literally getting off the boat by reporters, because he always had great quotes, he responded with this quote. He's throwing his hat in the ring, meaning I'm jumping in the race. So prize fighters at this time didn't make a lot of money. And they would travel around the country, usually like traveling fairs and carnivals. And they would set up a temporary ring. There are no real rules, so it could be anything, just rope around there and challenge any company. I'll challenge anybody to a fight. And if somebody, and then you have to pay to fight. But I'll challenge you. And then, I can beat up the champ. And so you throw your hat in to show your next to go fight. So that's where the term comes from. But now it means hat in the ring, you're in for the election. Thus, it's Rough Rider cap into the ring. So now the Republican Party is split. And Roosevelt is going to try to get the Republican nomination. And so that leads to one of the most exciting elections in American history. The election of 1912. And this is, see, Lady Columbia, Miss Columbia for the United States, Lady Columbia. And these are young men, that's the weird costumes, trying to suit as suitors. And the ones we care about, Debs, Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. At the Republican convention in Philadelphia, Roosevelt tried to get the nomination, but conservatives got their revenge. They got their revenge on Roosevelt, would not even allow him into the convention. And he did things like rent a bunch of elephants from the circus and store, elephants for Republicans, and went around the convention hall in Philadelphia, did everything to try to get people to pay attention. Nope, they nominated Taft. And this shows the once friends, old that sign, but PR and Taft fighting. Now Taft actually considered not running again. But once Roosevelt so bitterly attacked him, Taft decided, I'm going to run again just to keep Roosevelt from becoming president. I don't care. I will not allow him. I will get my revenge on Roosevelt because I didn't want to be president, and now you attack me. So now the Republicans are split, and don't forget, we have a winner-take-all system. Now, Roosevelt, Taft will get the Republican nomination. Roosevelt will go to a minor little third party. Remember, these third parties don't do much, winner take all. And he said, I will run as a progressive. And when announcing the progressive, now he liked to beat his chest. There's a lot of this house. And Roosevelt was asked by a reporter, how do you feel, Mr. Roosevelt? Are you ready for another vigorous campaign? And he said, I feel as fit as a bull moose. Thus, the bull moose party. And that's why you can see a lot of bull moose with this infectious grin and glasses. Now, third party, if they ever do fairly well in an election, it's because they have a popular person running. That's the term you might hear is a man on votes. Just this hero comes in, gets a lot of votes, and then that's it. Once he's out of the party dies. And that's what's going to happen. Now, Roosevelt is going to run a very energetic campaign. And he'll call his new proposal the New Nationalism. He announced it. This is the paper of his announcing the reforms he wants. It's a square deal, but it's more. He's going to take more liberal economic terms, even the term liberal economics is not used, and push for social justice and even socialist solutions. Like he literally talked about the federal government should take over railroads, public utilities, and phone. They're common carriers, too important for the use of people. He talked about, here you can see even a minimum wage, workers' compensation insurance, old age pension, Social Security. He is the exact opposite of what conservatives then, as now, believe. We were pretty far. And of course, emphasizing more than just women's rights, women need the right to vote, period. Now, did he really mean it? Or was that to try to make him look like even more progressive? The Democrats, they nominated the progressive governor of New Jersey, but he's originally from Virginia. He was president of Princeton College. A Southerner named Woodrow Wilson. There we go, Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic nominee for president. And his program, we have new nationalism, and now we have new freedom. So we have new freedom. And it's very much like the square deal again. There's not a lot of difference. And once again, he emphasized within suffrage. Now he's a Southerner. I mentioned him once before because, yes, he was a progressive, and he most certainly did not believe in equal rights. He was the president who talked about the glorious Ku Klux Klan. So, what's the difference, though? The difference is huge. It's on monopolies. Everyone write down regulation of monopolies. Teddy Roosevelt would believe not all monopolies are bad. There are some, he literally would say, good trust. And you see, here's a picture of him tomorrow. You want me to tell you the teddy bear story? I'll tell you the teddy bear story. Roosevelt, the good trust never tamed, and the bad trust he shoots. They're a good trust. Why are they good trust? Because they're more efficient. The best example are utilities. A single utility is more efficient than a bunch of utilities going in hell, but they should be heavily regulated. Think about utilities. Is it efficient to have 5 different electric companies, all with 5 different sets of power lines going all over the town, or one heavily regulated utility, much more efficient? But then bad trust, break them up. And who would decide what the bad trusts are? The president. So, good trust, bad trust. And this is going to play liberal economics and for years. Good trust, bad trust. Play them, because how do you decide this? Wilson, all monopolies are bad, period. Strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act, more competition. So even if it's more efficient, it doesn't matter. Its monopolies are corrupt. And I should add, Franklin Roosevelt really struggled with this. Roosevelt would try both, to do both. No monopolies, but there are some good ones. Then by the end, he would go pretty much to this. And that's what I would be born with, but certainly not what we are today. And that would be the big difference between the two. They're both pretty prejudiced. I don't know if they really meant women's rights. They did not believe in civil rights. But the monopolies. The socialists, though, were the strongest they're ever going to be in American history, would be right here in 1912. Gene Debs was incredibly popular. But their campaign was close to the progressives. And the problem with the third party is this. A vote for Debs will take away votes from a more progressive candidate like Roosevelt or Wilson. And so even though Debs is going to get a lot of votes, a lot of people who might have voted for Debs will end up voting for Roosevelt or Wilson because they don't want Taft to be president. And that shows the problem with our system for having more than one party or two parties. The problem. Now, sorry, he did that. Teddy Roosevelt was going to go to Milwaukee to give a speech. And there's Pat in the ring, and he was a heck of a speaker. His voice was really high, almost squeaky, but that was good without microphones. It went over a bigger area. Really high voice. And he would give a speech. And remember I told you how well he could write? He also had kind of a photographic memory. If he wrote a speech and he would write, we're talking an hour, hour and a half speech. So 20, 25 pages, handwritten. He wrote it, it's memorized. What a gift. Photographic memory does not mean you're smart. You can still be an idiot. But boy, does that help having that recall. It really helps. So, he write it, hold it up. Think about 20 pages, hold it up with his pocket. I ever got that image? So when he's in Milwaukee to give a speech, he was going to, he had a speech, hold it up in his pocket. He wasn't going to look at it, but he had it just in case. And when he's arriving, that's him giving another speech. We don't have photographs of that, but fortunately I have the Lego book assassinations. So here he is, the Lego Teddy Roosevelt arriving, and John Schenck approached him just before he was to give the speech, and walked up with a brown or black powder revolver, and from about 4 feet away, fired and hit Roosevelt right here. Right there. But what saved his life? The folded up speech. Slowed the bullet so much that it lodged in his rib and didn't penetrate his heart. So there's Roosevelt hit, as you can see by the Lego blood. Not only did that not stop Roosevelt from going to the convention hall where he was speaking, he finished the speech and spoke for an hour and a half, blood pooling around his feet. And when he responded, but what, Mr. President, Mr. President, you're always Mr. President. Mr. President, are you okay? And he said, I feel it's, I'm sorry, he said, it will take a lot more than a bullet to stop a bull moose. And everyone cheered. He finished his speech. The bullet was too close to his heart to remove. But, oh, and that's the man who shot him, John Schenck. And I love the headline. Roosevelt survived, but we'll finish it tomorrow. I will tell you tomorrow the teddy bear story and the children's story. Sound good? Have the reading done. I probably won't give a quiz.